You're taking the time, and we will record you as well. But we're so grateful for you taking the time to join us for this really exciting conversation with author Jared Cohen, who recently released Life After Power. So I'm Diana Petty. I'm the director of the University of Chicago Leadership and Society Initiative, and we have the true pleasure of hosting this discussion today. So LSI, as we call it, supports accomplished leaders in transitioning from their primary careers into next chapters of leadership for society. And we do this on two scales. The first is to help individuals live more meaningful, connected, and fulfilling lives. And then secondarily, to help society by harnessing the considerable talents, expertise, and wisdom of these advanced leaders to drive positive social, economic, and environmental change. So as part of that wisdom, we invite into dialogue and investigation and exploration various examples of purposeful leadership later in life, and particularly aim to take a look at exemplars who have activated their leadership on meaningful service to society. So of course, Life After Power by Jared Cohen does just that in an extraordinarily captivating exploration of how 7 former US presidents engaged life and work after their presidencies. And I think you'll hear this from Jared momentarily, but it's striking the myriad examples and pathways that these 7 extraordinary leaders took. And I think that's a huge part of our hypothesis behind LSI, that there is not a one-size-fits-all model. And really our goal is to help fellows find their sense of purposefulness that is unique to their values and what really matters most to them. So with that, I will turn it over to our moderator for this conversation, Dean of the Graham School, Seth Green. Seth and Jared, thank you so much. Looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Diana. We're really excited for this conversation, and I am so thrilled to welcome Jared. And Jared is a very accomplished leader. He is the president of global affairs and co-head of applied innovation at Goldman Sachs, where he joined as a partner in 2022. He is also the former CEO of Jigsaw, which he founded at Alphabet, and he was an extraordinary leader in government. He is also a New York Times bestselling author. And I heard that this particular book isn't just New York Times bestselling. It is actually at the very top of the charts. It was number 9 when it debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. So Jared, I am really excited to welcome you and to have you here to talk with us this afternoon about your book. And let me add your spotlight here so that we can see you in full discourse, and let us get started actually with a little bit about you, because before we jump into the book, I want to lay the table with a bit of background on who you are and how you came to this book. You were a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, published your first book nearly 20 years ago on the Rwandan genocide, and then went into business, had the storied career that I've just described, and that is continuing at I believe are your offices at Goldman right now. And I'm curious if you could just talk about kind of how you've kept a passion and focus on history. This is not your first. You had Accidental Presidents, which was on the bestseller list before this. And just a bit about your journey and how you've approached this dual life as a business leader and historian. And then we'll jump into this particular venture.
Well, first of all, Seth, thank you for having me, Diana. Thank you as well. And look, I appreciate all of you being with me today. There's a lot of ways you can spend your time, and the fact that you're choosing to spend it digging into this book, it's very exciting. I guess I don't look at it so much as a dual life. I've always had a thesis since I was pretty young that, I'm a kind of curiosity chaser. And so when people ask me what I do, I don't say I work at Goldman Sachs. I don't say I worked at Alphabet. I don't say I was in government. I say I manage a portfolio of my curiosities. Sometimes I look at my portfolio of curiosities, and right now I've got a pretty big position in tech. I've got a pretty big position in foreign policy. I've got a big position now in finance. And when I feel like there's something I'm curious about and it's not in my portfolio, I diversify that portfolio. But what I would say is the very first position in my portfolio of curiosities, the one that has been consistent longer than any of the others, is a love for American history, but specifically of the presidency. It goes back to when I was 8 years old and got my first little bag of campaign buttons, and when my parents bought me that first rhyming book called The Buck Stops Here. And I still remember some of the rhymes, right? It was 1 page for each president. It was, 10 and 7, Johnson A. They almost took his job away. I mean, you sort of don't forget these things. And it's been a sort of consistent position that I've built in my life. And it's interesting, the way that it relates to my day job has changed over time. When I was in government, there's a nice sort of nexus, because you're working I worked in two presidential administrations, the Bush administration and the Obama administration. In tech, I found that I was in a sector that doesn't at all reflect on the past, and then is surprised that they find themselves, bogged down in sort of the mud of reality as if it's the first time that things have happened. So I found that my sort of mind being conditioned to look backwards in order to understand the present and where we're going was useful. And now in finance, I surprisingly find it quite useful too, because all of our clients want to talk to us about the elections. And I find that, being a sort of presidential historian is just an unusual platform for one to have working at, a big investment bank.
Well, so let's dig into your role as presidential historian. And I want to really set the table for this book in particular now. Why did you decide to write about the post-presidency? Obviously, there's a lot to tell as presidential historian about what they do in office, but you've chosen life after office. And so I'm curious for the why that part of their chapter.
Yeah, look, it's a strange book for somebody. I started writing this book when I was in my 30s. I'm now 42. It's a strange book for somebody my age to write, except I've always, been interested, as I mentioned, in presidential history. I'm the son of a psychologist, so I grew up sort of rummaging through my dad's books on behavioral psychology. So I've always been interested in kind of why human beings make the decisions that they make. And throughout my entire career, I've always sort of kind of grappled with this elusive question of what do you do next? And it's a combination of your own kind of ambitious impulses driving you to want to answer the question of what's next, and all the annoying people around you asking you what you're going to do next. I mean, I've been at Goldman Sachs for all of a week, and people were like, what do you think you're going to do next? And I said, I'm going to do this for a while. Right. And so this is a question that we're all going to ask many, many times throughout our lives, and it's as relevant for somebody graduating from university to somebody in the twilight years of their life and everything in between. And those questions of what's next is sometimes they're personal, sometimes they're professional, sometimes they relate, sometimes they're sort of micro versions of the question, sometimes they're really kind of game changing, life changing, questions that you're grappling with. And when I finished my last book, Accidental Presidents, looked at what happened the 8 times in history a US president died in office, and the country kind of dealt with these abrupt transfers of power. And so when you're sort of done with a book, you end up with this kind of postpartum depression that only gets satisfied and dealt with once you figure out your next book. And I figured I looked at what happens when presidents didn't survive the office. Might be an interesting question to ask what happens when they do survive the office. And you sort of read these thick biographies, the Rod Chernow biographies, the Doris Kearns Goodwin biographies, and you kind of I realized I was closing the book when the presidency was over, and I was interested in whether the last 50 pages was of any interest. And so as I dug into the 45 men that have been president 46 times, because Cleveland did it twice, and you get rid of the ones that died or died shortly thereafter, I think what was so interesting is I only found 7 presidents whose life after power I thought was worth writing about. There wasn't even a close 8th, right? And it's not a ranking of post presidencies. What I was interested in is, did any of them find a greater sense of purpose after they left the White House? And it's the most dramatic retirement in the world. Seth and I were talking before we jumped on, none of us, have the ego to think that we have anything in common with presidents of the United States, except when you dig into their stories, these seemingly unrelatable figures, all of a sudden they fall harder than anybody else, particularly if they get fired by, a couple 100 million people. And 2, it's harder for them to top what they did last than any of us will have to do. And so when they leave office, all of a sudden they go from being unrelatable to just filled with prescriptions for the rest of us. And I didn't quite appreciate that until I started digging into their stories. And so the way the book is organized, I look at 7 different presidents: Thomas Jefferson, John Quincy Adams, Grover Cleveland, William Howard Taft, Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, and George W. Bush. And the book is organized with each one of them serving as a case study for one particular model for how to do life after power. And so the idea is we're all different people. There's no blueprint for how to do these transitions, but one of these case studies or some combination of these case studies will speak to each of you, based on your own experience more than the rest. And we can kind of dig into each of those.
Well, let me just affirm a couple of the statements that you've made, Jared. One is that, for designing this next chapter, it is especially difficult for people who have reached that great accomplishment. And as you know, we're here with the group within UChicago hosting you, being Leadership and Society Initiative, because this is a group of really accomplished individuals. And what so many of them want to do is really meaningful in their next chapter. But often as you reach the end of one longstanding career, your identity, your community, and your purpose are all wrapped into that. And
Yes.
so how do you discern and discover and activate what's next when you've already done something so incredible in this chapter before, right? And so I think there's something eminently relatable there.
Yeah.
And I'll just share that I am raising two daughters who are 10 and 13. And what's really interesting to me is that they relate to every single Taylor Swift song, and they have very little in common with, a mega star. But you realize, oh, all human experience is relatable, especially when people go through a moment. In her case, she's able to put it to lyrics. In the case of these presidents, they're able to put it into memoirs. And you begin to realize, oh my gosh, there's so much in common in this human experience.
Yes.
And these next chapters, you're always seeking to develop in a way that really is ultimately human, because it is ultimately about how does this relate to my identity and purpose, not just a tactical exercise in terms of your ability to do something from a skill level or a knowledge level. Let's dive into the book and see how people approach these chapters. As I read it, I was struck by the diversity of experiences that you present. So you have someone like Adams, and he's passionately embracing the anti-slavery movement. And I mean, he is literally as involved in politics the day after he's president as, the day prior. And then you have someone like George Bush, who really lives more of a portfolio life, gets out of politics per se, although he continues to work on things like AIDS in Africa, but really tries to do it out of the political life, and then takes up hobbies like painting as a major part of his next chapter. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the spectrum of approaches that you saw across different presidents.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let me give you a little curtain raiser for each of the seven, because each of them got after this question of life after power in a very different way. There are a couple common threads across all of them, but what I'm struck by is how different their approaches have been. So Thomas Jefferson is a story. Anybody who fancies themselves a lifelong founder or a serial entrepreneur, the Thomas Jefferson story will speak to you. His life was basically a trilogy with 3 volumes that he personally etched on his epitaph. The author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and the father and founder of the University of Virginia. He never wanted to be president. He wanted to be Secretary of State. He didn't want to be vice president, and neither of those 3 things were worthy of his epitaph. He co-founded the Republic and believed that he understood the flaws that the founders had left behind, and he believed if the country did not have a proper arts and sciences university, which he thought of as kind of the university of the future, they wouldn't be able to train the next generation to fix the flaws and iterate on those flaws and ensure the Republic survived. And he finally opens the doors of the UVA, University of Virginia, at 82 years old. So his story is, that chapter is about, what it looks like to be a serial founder as your and how that features into your next act. John Quincy Adams, that chapter focuses on somebody that wants to have a second act but doesn't have any idea what it is. There's not a particular cause that they're passionate about. They don't know where to pursue it. They just know they want to have another act. And John Quincy Adams' presidency was an intermission between 2 of the greatest acts in American history. First one architected for him by his famous parents, that was entirely about becoming president of the United States. His presidency was a disaster. He's voted out of office in 1828 and doesn't know what to do. He's already been president. He's been Secretary of State. He's been an ambassador to just about every country. He's been a senator. And so the only public service job he hasn't had yet is in the House of Representatives. And he begrudgingly agrees to be elected to the House of Representatives. He then goes on to serve 9 terms. And in that much lower station, he discovers a much higher calling, which is to become an abolitionist. And so the cause found him rather than him finding the cause. And this is a man who got his first job appointed by George Washington, and he dies in 1848 serving alongside a freshman congressman named Abraham Lincoln. And he takes a fringe radical movement at the time in the 1830s and 1840s, abolitionism, and he mainstreams it just in time for Lincoln to take the torch. Grover Cleveland is the story of a comeback. He's the only, lots of presidents have contemplated a comeback. He's the only one who's achieved it. Lots of parallels to today. We can talk about similarities and differences, but in Cleveland's case, it's a cautionary tale and a reminder that the comeback is rarely, if you actually achieve it, it's rarely as sweet as it was the first time around, and it, in his case, led to a lot more unhappiness and a decline in his popularity. We can come back to that. William Howard Taft is a story for anybody who has passed up an opportunity because the timing wasn't right or the circumstances weren't right. He never wanted to be president, but his wife, his brothers, and his mentor and friend Theodore Roosevelt were determined to make him president. All he ever wanted was to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He achieves that in his last decade of life. And his story is a story of, and it's a powerful reminder that a dream deferred can still be a dream achieved, or a dream that's not denied. Herbert Hoover is a story of recovery. A man who lived to be 90 years old is defined by the 4 years that he was president, characterized by the Great Depression. Before he was president, he was known as the great humanitarian. He was the man who fed Europe after World War I. He led relief in the Great Mississippi Flood in 1927. He was an orphan who became a self-made millionaire. He was known as a great executive, and he was a man with tremendous bipartisan appeal. And in 1928, he basically waltzes into the White House with bipartisan support in one of the most lopsided victories in history. His story after leaving office is a 32-year story where he wants to recover that which he has lost. And at first, it's a confusion between the presidency and the status that he had before. And once he gets out of politics, he finally unshackles himself and focuses on once again becoming the great humanitarian. Truman resurrects him to figure out how to feed the world after World War II. He reminds the world that he's a great executive when both Truman and Eisenhower call on him to reorganize the executive branch of government, not once, but not twice. And in his final act of public service, Joe Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father, calls on him to reconcile the defeated Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy in one last act of bipartisan service, and he recovers his good name in his lifetime. It gets trounced upon again posthumously, but in his lifetime he recovers it. Jimmy Carter is the story of the former. He basically is the first one to realize that you can actually build a whole career out of being a former version of yourself. And he wanted a never-ending presidency, but he couldn't achieve that for even 8 years, let alone his entire life. And he figured out and quickly realized that he could basically build infrastructure around being a former president and create the never-ending post-presidency, which is what he did. And at 43 years plus, he's not in an active presidency anymore, but he's still obviously alive. And then George W. Bush, I always knew this would be the most controversial one, but when I looked at the active living presidents, there was only one whose popularity had doubled. And it was George W. Bush, and he had accomplished that, investing less in his legacy than any of his active contemporaries, and I wanted to understand why. And in George W. Bush's case, I spent 9 hours interviewing him on the record. I did the longest interview with him about his post-presidency. I watched him paint. I sort of spent a ton of time with him. And what I realized is he's kind of a chapter guy. This chapter is called Moving On. Out of all the men who've served as president, he's the only one who has managed to completely detach from the presidency, and those who are critics of his administration will be driven nuts by this. But what I wanted to understand was the psychology of somebody who wants to move on and is looking for how. And he has this reverence for the Washington principle of one president at a time, which has aged well in the era of Trump. It's just a fact, whether you're a Trump supporter or not. Two, he's discovered a post-presidential voice through painting that it's allowed him to advocate for causes like veterans and American immigrants in ways that doesn't undermine his successor. And three, he has this sort of quarrelsome view about legacy. He views this idea of investing in your legacy as a dirty word, a selfish word. And he told me, he's like, look, they wrote 3 books about George Washington last year. By the time they get around to the other George, I'm going to be long gone. And he really finds it ridiculous that somebody will sacrifice the present to invest in a legacy that they're not going to be around to shape and that's going to be left to historians. And so I actually, it's funny, he's not an introspective guy at all. I think he would acknowledge that. Spending time with him and writing about him made me more introspective than probably anything else that I've done in my life, because it's just the way that he's able to detach and view his life through the lens of chapters. Like he closes the book on politics and he just doesn't look back. It's like a psychological thriller into the human brain because human beings don't function that way. And then the last thing that I'll say is that, again, these are 7 different models. The only common thread that I would call out, or maybe 2 common threads that I would call out. The first is each one of these men had something that they were deeply, deeply principled about. And some of them knew what that was going into the post-presidency. Some of them, like John Quincy Adams, discovered it later on. But each one of them doubled down on that core principle and found a way to manifest it in the post-presidency. And that's where the sense of purpose came from. But you need longevity as well. And every one of these 7 also developed something that could fall in the category of an endless learning experience or intellectual pursuit that kept them going until the very end of their life, which is why so many of them lived for such a long period of time.
Well, so I want to dive further into the lessons that you see emerging. You called out 2 themes that are across all the presidents, but one of the things that's striking is as I read it, and then you could compare the post-presidencies, you also begin to see lessons from those comparisons about how people handled this moment and how that then affected their wellness, their impact, how they then were perceived from a legacy perspective. And so I'm eager to dive into some of those lessons. I mean, I was struck in the Carter chapter about how Carter does build this post-presidency where he's still navigating global politics. He gets the Peace Prize. I mean, you and your writing about him clearly admire that leadership, but it's also clear that he is not shy about entering territory typically reserved for presidents and occasionally engaging in ways that are difficult for the successor. And so that's just one example of the takeaways. But I'm curious if you had, 3 to 5 takeaways that you had after writing this book for anyone who's endeavoring a post chapter or an encore chapter of leadership.
Yeah, so I'll answer one sidebar on Carter before I answer that. So Alex, so by the way, it's important to remember the founding fathers had almost no examples. They really didn't have any examples of the peaceful transfer of power. So they were natural. Remember, they were trying to build a republic that was the anti-monarchy, the anti-authoritarian system, and we take for granted just how absent or void of case studies the world was. And so they worried about this question of what to do with ex-presidents. And actually, Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 72, he writes, as a sort of a question which is far from rhetorical, which is, he asks, does it benefit the stability or the well-being of our republic to have half a dozen men who'd been elevated to the presidency wandering around the rest of us like discontented ghosts, right? And again, like that question feels like particularly pronounced right now. But with Jimmy Carter, you actually get an answer to Hamilton's question more than 200 years later, which is the answer is former presidents can either be tremendous partners to their successors, which Jimmy Carter has on both sides of the aisle, or they can be their most formidable adversaries and a nuisance to their successors, which Jimmy Carter has been on both sides of the aisle. And so he's a man of contrast, right? He's basically cured guinea worm and been a tremendous leader for global health and human rights and election monitoring. But I'll give you 2 bipartisan examples of him being a nuisance, right? So when George H.W. Bush, is getting ready to, orchestrate Operation, Desert Storm in one of the, the only examples of the UN participating in like permanent 5-member collective action to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, Jimmy Carter decides that this is a bad idea, and he writes a private letter to 3 of the permanent members of the Security Council, obviously excluding his own country and excluding Margaret Thatcher because he didn't really like her very much, urging them to go against President Bush's policy. That would be an example of being a nuisance to his successor. And then Bill Clinton in 1994 is dealing with a nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula, and Jimmy Carter decides that he's going to go save the day. And Bill Clinton decides he's going to co-opt him for this and tells Carter, fine, you want to go to North Korea? I'll support that. You can be a messenger, but under no uncertain terms are you to make any policy. You're not the president. And so Bill Clinton is surprised when he turns on CNN and Jimmy Carter is announcing the nuclear agreement that he's just negotiated with Kim Il-sung. And when Carter's asked about it privately, he basically says, I had no intention of just being a messenger. So there he's being a nuisance to his Democratic successor. I thought that was just kind of an interesting sidebar. And by the way, Jimmy Carter made no apology. He was actually quite transparent about this. As soon as he left office, he basically had two problems that he was solving. One is, he was $1 million in debt because his peanut farm went into a blind trust and it was terribly mismanaged. I don't know a lot about peanut farming, so I won't bother you with the sort of my amateur knowledge of why that ended up being the case. And the second is he made a determination that his faith commands him, as long as he lives wherever is needed for however long it takes, to do what his faith commands him to do, which is right. And he never had any intention of being the silent ex-president. So in a lot of respects, he and Bush, who, both of their legacies have aged very well, have gone about it in completely opposite ways. So it also shows you that there's no one path to this. So to your question, Seth, that first year is so important, right? It's so important, right? Where I see most of the presidents failed, all of the ingredients for their failure in the post-presidency was they either rushed into something right away or too soon, or they just couldn't get out of the past, right? So they either got fixated or bogged down in settling old scores, or they got sort of trapped in not being able to manage that transition in that first year. So that first year is so important, and it needs to be a time of reflection, separation, organizing your life, getting yourself the emotional availability to be clear-minded about what you do next. And again, it's all about identifying that thing that you're really principled about. The reason Carter was able to get after it so quickly, and Jefferson was able to get after it so quickly, they knew exactly what they were principled about. They just didn't know how to do it. In the case of John Quincy Adams, he didn't know. Right? Grover Cleveland, had never been happier than when he lost the presidency. The difference between him and Trump is Grover Cleveland never lost the popular vote, right? So 2024, it's going to be the only rematch between two presidents of the United States as the nominees of the two major parties other than 1892. Cleveland never lost the popular vote and didn't want to come back. He lost the Electoral College in 1888 because he took a principled stand against the Democratic Party bosses, against a high tariff. He comes back in 1892 because he believes he's the only Democrat able to fight against a runaway budget. His successor had signed the first billion-dollar budget. He's worried about the rising tide of imperialism, and he's worried about the prevalence of cheap money, meaning unlimited coinage of free silver, as opposed to sound money, which was the gold standard. And so he reluctantly comes back. And what Jimmy Carter does early on also is very important for anybody who leaves not on their own terms. The difference between him and Herbert Hoover kind of half tries to get the presidency back in 1936 and half tries in 1940. He really didn't have a chance in 1936. He had a real shot in 1940, but he wouldn't go all in because he didn't want to be sort of a two-time loser. In Jimmy Carter's case, he makes a decision the day he leaves office that as much as he misses the presidency and wants to be president, he makes a decision that he's not going to try to get that office back. And what that does is that separates him from that last chapter. So the most important thing, and they all do it in different ways, is the faster you can separate from your last chapter, the more it unshackles you and unburdens you from reflecting too much on the past and trying to get back what you lost. There's also an aspect of having to reorganize your life. Again, it's finances, it's sort of fixing broken relationships, and it depends on one's circumstances. And then there's just a mental transition that has to happen. The pace is different. It's a recalibration that has to happen, right? So whatever you end up doing next, it's not the same muscle memory, and it's not the same pace as what you did last. And you need to basically slow down and eventually stop in order to restart and drive in a different direction.
Well, I'll just say two of those insights resonate so strongly with how we've designed LSI. So I just want to call them out. I mean, this first about really needing to separate from that former life in order to embrace your new chapter. A woman who's on our advisory committee who's been very formative in our thinking is Anne Mulcahy, who had been CEO and chairman of Xerox. And what she shared in her experience as she made her transition was everyone told her, stay visible, stay proximate to what you were doing. And she took on a role with a private equity firm as a senior advisor. She was a host or a select guest on CNBC. And she found that that actually was not where her purpose laid, and that it wasn't until she actually decided not to move forward with those. And then she was at a dinner with Cokie Roberts at Save the Children that she found her next chapter and ended up being chair of Save the Children, going to more than 100 countries, really taking the issue of refugee rights as her passion for a decade. But it was only after she was able to get that distance that she was able to figure out what that looked like. And so as we designed LSI, the idea was, how do you build a whole year where people can have that space for discernment and deep discovery, separated from the lives that they've had? They actually move to Hyde Park. They become, lifelong learners and have the world open up again. And I think it really speaks to your observation. And the other is just this whole idea that as you build that next chapter, right, so much of it is about really getting into what is your intrinsic motivation, because so much of your life has been built around this extrinsic structure, right, that you need to kind of be in touch with a whole new side of you.
But one quick sidebar on that. There's two Herbert Hoover quotes that I think are really important here, because he understood two things. One, he once was asked kind of why his work ethic increased as he got older, and he said, look, you basically have I'm paraphrasing you, he said you basically have one or two options. You can either work harder as you get older, or you can sit around talking about the pills that you're taking to live another year. Now, the other thing that Herbert Hoover said, which I think is also important, which is, and this is useful for somebody who kind of has to transition with some degree of controversy. Somebody asked him, I think at 89 years old, how he dealt with his critics over time, and he said, "I outlived the bastards." Right, and this theme of longevity is very, very important, because I would argue that look, retirement is a mirage. Right, everyone on this call knows that. The whole concept of retirement has changed over time. All it is a transition from that thing that you sprinted towards, which superficially is supposed to be the most important thing you do. And retirement, in my opinion, is shifting from a sprint runner to a marathon runner. It's a different race, right? And I've seen this with each of the presidents, and there's different techniques if you're a sprinter from the techniques that if you're a marathon runner. And so I think of these post-presidency as like a learning capsule for what are the techniques that make you a good marathon runner when your previous chapter was as a great sprinter. And again, I think there's another good lesson here from George W. Bush, which is the painting is actually not a hobby. I mean, this is actually something he's quite quarrelsome with. And I watched it. He paints 6 to 8 hours a day, never misses a day, never misses it. Right. And, he's been a painter longer than he was a politician. And it's how he expresses himself. It's how he learns. And his view is, look, I play golf, I run, I mountain bike. At some point, I'm not going to be able to do any of those things. And I look at painting and I can keep getting better even if I'm in a wheelchair. I can have a stroke and have to wear a paintbrush on my head like Chuck Close. And I can still do that in all the way until the very end, and it keeps me learning, right? And so that endless learning experience is one of the most important attributes that makes somebody a good sort of metaphorical marathon runner as opposed to a sprinter.
Well, we have a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to start getting to them, and we'll hopefully get through as many as possible. There are a few about who's not included in the book, and so I'll just ask that, kind of combining some questions here. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama are the most commonly asked about as to the why not, along with Richard Nixon. And maybe if you could just speak to those individually or just the criteria overall.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually get asked about Nixon a lot. And, I mentioned that when I sort of canvassed, all the presidents that survived the office, and you don't have to look long at James K. Polk because he died 3 months after. There's a handful that died shortly after, right? You're left with, still a pretty large number. So before I answer those specifically, let me go with who would be the two that I think, or I would say three that I think are sort of not honorable mention, but distant options for number 8. I get asked about Ulysses S. Grant a lot because he was the first president to write a memoir about the presidency. Although Thomas Jefferson was the first president to write a memoir, Jefferson didn't write about the presidency. At the time, at the time there was sort of people were beginning to write the American story, and John Marshall had written a multi-volume history of the United States that basically minimized Jefferson's role, and that's why he wrote an autobiography, but Grant was the first one to do a presidential memoir. The reason I don't include it, even though it's the gold standard for presidential memoirs, is the reason Grant did that is he was completely broke. He just needed money, right? And so that's not purpose for me, even though it was a great accomplishment. I was asked what I was really interested in, who found a greater sense of purpose. And for Grant, his greatest sense of purpose was becoming a general and attempting being a politician. His presidency was a disaster. He tries for a non-consecutive third term in 1880 and loses on the 34th ballot to James Garfield, who wasn't even running for president. And then I get asked about Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt, is, first of all, he's my favorite president, but his post-presidency, features him basically, making a run for the presidency again in 1912 as a third party, splitting the Republican ticket and handing the presidency to the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, becoming bitter, nearly killing himself, navigating the river of doubt in the Amazon, and then very churlishly begging Woodrow Wilson to send him in as a cavalry, to fight in World War I, like he did with the Rough Riders, when the whole technology story of war had changed, right? And so it's just not it's a post-presidency filled with ambition, and it actually lacked the purpose of his pre-presidency and his presidency. In the case of Nixon, people want me to include Nixon as part of a story of recovery and so forth. And when I looked at Nixon side by side with Herbert Hoover, one felt more vain to me, the other felt much more purposeful to me. And I just thought Hoover's story was a far more inspiring and purposeful story than Richard Nixon. And I actually felt, at time, look, Hoover was mixed up in his own vanity also, but it was bigger. It was bigger. He really wanted to he was a man who really wanted to be of service. That was his sense of purpose. And then in case of Bill Clinton, Bill Clinton is kind of the anti-Bush in the sense that I don't know a living ex-president who's done more to invest in his legacy than Bill Clinton, and the norms of society have kind of caught up with him. And I don't think his post-presidency has aged well, and I don't think it will age well posthumously, even though I think he's done a lot of good in the ex-presidency, in his post-presidency. It's kind of going in the wrong direction for him, and it's going in the wrong direction while he's alive. It's kind of the opposite of Hoover. And in the case of Obama, I think that Obama, it's too early to evaluate Obama's post-presidency. My personal view is I don't see the sense of purpose yet. I see a lot of activities, but he's so young. And you look at the longevity of some of these ex-presidents that while I'm not yet inspired by his post-presidency and I don't see the sense of purpose, all the history tells me he has plenty of time to get after it. And if he does discover that sense of purpose and have an extraordinary post-presidency, look, it took Herbert Hoover 12 years of FDR's, presidency on the sidelines to even begin to get a shot at resurrecting that which he had lost, right? And so Obama has plenty of time, but I don't see it yet.
We have a question here from an emotional and psychological perspective. What would you say leaders should do to deal with the identity crisis that comes with the loss of power and relevance?
Look, it's very hard. Only out of all the presidents that I feature, I'm not convinced that any of them, other than George W. Bush, has actually been happier in the post-presidency, right? So this is important. I distinguish between finding a greater sense of purpose and finding greater happiness. Actually, I would argue, I actually think Jefferson as well. Jefferson and Bush, and ironically, one that left office probably, with historically low popularity, and one that left office with historically high popularity. And by the way, both 2 terms, right? So neither got fired by the American people. So I think the first thing that I would say is purpose can actually be mutually exclusive from happiness, as you see from, at least 5 of the 7 that I write about. Happiness in and of itself can be a feature of purpose, as you see with George W. Bush. I think that dealing with the transition, I think it depends on whether you got fired from your job and the circumstances that you left your job in, versus if you were happy and left on your own terms. it's hard, right? You go from having this important day to day and this very rapid pace and all this power to, spending your day bogged down in ego and your finances and day-to-day stuff. I mean, poor George Washington went from being the founding father to, he went to Mount Vernon after he left office, and he spent his day chasing down people who owed him money. He had to found a whiskey business, not because he was passionate about whiskey, but because he was completely broke. And he was the most famous man in America. So all these voyeurs would show up in the middle of nowhere in Mount Vernon, and he had no choice but to put them up, much to the detriment of his bank account, right? And so I think that, like, you need a project when you leave office or when you leave your job. And so I think what a lot of these presidents would say if they were alive today is, when you leave office or you leave the job, there's some things that you inevitably neglected, and it can be relationships, it can be finances, it can be hobbies, whatever it is. Busy yourself in year number one. Like, busy yourself with all the things that you neglected while you were busy with your last career. It's just like, it helps you adjust. It gives you some points on the board. There are things that need to be done, and it buys you time to make that transition again from being a sprinter to being a marathon runner. They would also all say that you'll have steps forward and steps backwards, right? Even the ones that were successful, right? The ones that were able to detach more, they had setbacks, right? And it kind of ebbs and flows, and you need to give yourself the space to manage that, because it can be a torturous thing, right? It's not easy to give up. In the case of presidents, they have a hard time giving up Air Force One, but any job has a lesser. I mean, there's something less than Air Force One that you miss. Maybe it's your corner office, maybe it's the free coffee, maybe it's the corporate card, maybe it's the stage and the podium, whatever it is. Have a healthy sense of what you're giving up, and recognize that you're going to fill that with something else, and you don't have to know what that is right away. In fact, it's good to not know right away what that is.
It's really interesting, Jared. David Brooks, who is one of our faculty members for the Leadership in Society Initiative, talks a lot about making this transition at this stage of moving into your next chapter from an extrinsic set of motivations where the locus of incentive is outside of you. So presidents obviously care deeply about this country, they're motivated, but they are fulfilling voters' needs, and they have very tight accountability to the extrinsic world. And suddenly, not only do you lose power, but you also lose this extrinsic accountability. And so suddenly you have to get in touch with something that for a president would have had to have been lost a long time ago, because there's no way you could become president by being entirely intrinsically motivated. It just doesn't happen that you're 100% intrinsically motivated and you happen to poll with a majority of the American people to get elected president. So suddenly you have to use this muscle that you may not have used in a long time. Even though you were doing it for the right reasons, you were still every day waking up. There's a ton of pressure on me. I have to fulfill these huge things for all of these stakeholders. And now suddenly I'm left to my own device. I don't even know when I'm motivated. I don't know. I don't remember that. And so I think it just jives really well with what you're describing. And that's a lot of what we look at in the curriculum, is how do you get back in touch and reconnect in the way, in many ways, I think George Bush did. Figuring out painting was something that he would be passionate about that he wouldn't have known from what he was up to for many years. I have one final question here. I think it's a really interesting one. It's from Stephen Tang. It's, how did father and son presidents handle their transition similarly or differently? And obviously you have Adams and you have Bush, so you've got two pairings there. And so I'm curious if you looked at the dads in those cases and what you might have gleaned from different ways than their parents, that they handled it. I don't see George W. Bush jumping out of any planes regularly. So I know that's at least one difference that may be between them.
Yeah, so I would add one tweak to that question. There's only there's only three presidents. Ironically, they're all presidents that I wrote about, which is not a coincidence, that had direct familiarity with the post-presidency. John Quincy Adams, because he watched his father. Grover Cleveland, because he watched himself. And George W. Bush, because he watched his father. And it's interesting that the three presidents that had a direct experience with the post-presidency are three of the seven that I feature. It's a perfect scorecard there, right? So I think that's an important data point, right? That personal familiarity actually means something. It's a little different in each of their cases. So in the case of John Quincy Adams, he he actually made a lot of the same mistakes as his father, despite his success, right? His father, was defeated for re-election in 1800, was very bitter, very angry, and very broke. And John Quincy Adams fell into all of those traps. The difference, and by the way, they both lived a long time afterwards. So but they got after it in different ways. John Adams never found a meaningful way to get back into service, although he found a ceremonial way. And he never found a cause that for him was more purposeful than founding the Republic. For John Quincy Adams, it was easier for him to find a cause that was greater than the cause his parents imposed on him, which was being president. He never really had a cause of his own. And so once he left office, he had no more, he had no natural clarity on what he cared about. He abhorred the institution of slavery, but he never did much with that. He becomes passionate about slavery through his passion for the right to petition. He goes to Congress and he doesn't really know what to do, so he just starts reading petitions, and some of them are from abolitionists. And he's shocked by the reaction from the slaveocracy when he reads these petitions, and the angrier they get, the louder he reads them. And the louder he reads them, the more inundated he becomes with these petitions. And eventually they try to gag him. And he's really passionate about the right to petition and the right to speech. And it's only after he ultimately defends the slaves in the famous Amistad case that he acknowledges that he's an abolitionist. He actually fights it for a while. In the case of Grover Cleveland, he loved his first post-presidency, loved it. He hated his second post-presidency. In fact, he gets asked after he leaves office the second time what we should do with ex-presidents, and he says they should be taken out to a 5-acre lot and shot. And then he corrects himself and he says, in second thought, a 5-acre lot is far too big for an ex-president, and they shouldn't be shot because they've already suffered enough. In the case of George W. Bush, it's interesting. I knew George H.W. Bush very well, and obviously I know George W. Bush even better. And people, I wanted so desperately to believe that there were these magical moments where the only living father and son in modern times would get together and ponder the post presidencies and reflect on their presidencies, and it just didn't happen. Right? It's just not they're not programmed that way. But what George W. Bush did say is the thing that he learned from his father was how to be a dignified, graceful ex-president. His father was very bitter about having lost the election in 1992, and watching the contrast between that bitterness and how his father's legacy got trampled upon, and his father's unwillingness to engage in the political fray, that meant a lot to him. He also learned how to have thick skin from his father. And so when his own legacy is getting trampled upon after leaving office, he just had an easier time dealing with it than if he hadn't borne witness to it himself.
Well, this has been an incredible discussion, Jared. You are a brilliant historian, and so I'm glad this is in your portfolio of curiosities. And I'll just close with this reflection. I'm in my early 40s as well, so I can relate on that age level to, here we are, and yet we hear these stories, and they are so insightful, and they are shaping in terms of how you then imagine your future. And what's been striking to me about this book, as well as being involved in the Leadership in Society initiative, is that you begin to realize that no matter where you get to, you can feel like when you're in our age and you're kind of climbing the mountain, that, you get to the top and then you get to stay there, right? There's a sense, you reach the presidency and that's your apex and then you just stay. There is no place where you stay, right? And there is no ground that is forever. And I think what is truly liberating about that, and this is apparently what George W. Bush realized, is, well, then you don't have to worry about constantly maintaining. And if you can free yourself of that sense of obligation, that you have to have your next act be greater on some, accountability to extrinsic motivations level, right? If you can free yourself of that, then you can begin to open up the new chapter of purpose, because you're actually free to find other things. Because if you keep searching for what can I do that is bigger than the presidency, obviously you're going to find failure because there is nothing. But if you just sense that, okay, I want to do something meaningful and I can listen to myself and be that kind of motivation from within, you can maybe find both the happiness that you're describing and the purpose in that next chapter. And so I'm grateful that another 40-something has decided to investigate this topic and really unearth an amazing amount of both historically significant information and also life significant information. Thank you for joining us and for all your insights today.
And Seth, if I could say one last thing,
I don't know if you have a chance to see it. It is all about people that have actually read the full book alongside this conversation and are recommending it to others. So just want to echo their words as well. But please, you have the last word.
Yeah, one last thing I'd say. One, obviously, I hope you'll read the book, but I really I would love for you all to proliferate the stories in this book, encourage people to get it. Obviously, I want the book to do well, but but more importantly, these are case studies that are typically left out of the conversation. It's not all former CEOs and athletes, and so we're missing a really, really valuable repository of case studies that the rest of us can learn from. I also would note that from Thomas Jefferson to George W. Bush, it covers the full arc of our country's history, and it's a really important time to reflect on civics, and the book also offers something there. And by the way, I think it's a really important time to reflect on this question of what to do with ex-presidents. You have the two oldest candidates in history in only the second presidential rematch in history. And I think part of the reason we're in this situation is you have two presidents that don't want to give up power. And so it's an important time to reflect on this question of what have some presidents done when they left office that reminds us that the very idea of an ex-presidency is a feature of a democracy, not a bug. There's a lot of countries around the world where you don't get to be an ex-president unless you're in prison or suffer some other ill fate. So I hope you'll tell people about the book. I hope you'll read the book, and I hope you'll help me get this story out. And I thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Jared. And I'll just say that, I think both Biden and Trump maybe need to learn about Leadership in Society initiative, and that there are these ways to discern meaningful next chapters beyond. So we'll work on that one in our next chapter for the initiative. Truly, thank you for your insights. It's been awesome to converse with you, and really grateful for the impact this book is having on both our understanding of history and our understanding of civics and engagement in the world. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and to be continued for those who are part of this initiative.
Thanks, everyone.